The shadows of Blackwood Manor. Blackwood Manor stood isolated on the edge of a dense, whispering forest. For decades, the house had been abandoned, its once grand facade now cloaked in vines and decay. Locals avoided it, whispering tales of those who entered and never returned. They spoke of screams echoing through the night and shadows that moved even when the moon was full. Amelia, a freelance journalist obsessed with uncovering the truth behind urban legends, decided to spend a night at the manor. Armed with a flashlight, a camera, and a voice recorder, she entered the creaking gates just as the sun dipped below the horizon. Inside, the air was stale, and the wooden floor groaned under her weight. Dust particles floated in the beam of her flashlight, and the faint scent of mildew and rot clung to every corner. Amelia set up her equipment in the grand hall, its high ceilings adorned with cobweb-covered chandeliers. Hours passed without incident, but then, just as the clock struck midnight, a chilling breeze swept through the room, extinguishing her flashlight. Panic surged, but she quickly lit a candle she'd brought. The flickering flame cast long, wavering shadows on the walls, which seemed to twist and writhe unnaturally. Suddenly, Amelia heard a faint whisper. It was indistinct at first, but grew clearer. "Leave, or suffer." The voice was neither male nor female, but guttural, as though it came from deep within the walls. She tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was just her imagination. But then the whispers turned to screams, agonized, echoing screams that seemed to come from all directions. The floor beneath her feet began to shudder, and she saw a dark, shapeless figure emerging from the far corner of the room. It had no face, only hollow, black voids where eyes should be. Amelia grabbed her camera and took a picture. The flash momentarily blinded her, but when her vision cleared, the figure was gone. Trembling, she replayed the photo on her camera. The image showed not one but dozens of shadowy figures standing behind her, their hollow eyes fixed on her. The Shadows of Blackwood Manor, Part 2. Amelia's hands shook as she stared at the camera screen. She turned quickly, hoping the shadows were nothing more than a trick of the light. But the room behind her was empty, silent, except for the faint creaking of the wooden floor. But something was wrong. The grand hall, which had felt expansive and open when she entered, now seemed to press in on her, the walls appearing closer, suffocatingly so. She steadied her breath and reminded herself of the mantra she'd always used during investigations. Fear is the enemy of clarity. As Amelia leaned down to pick up her voice recorder, she noticed something new. A child's laugh, faint and echoing. The sound was coming from upstairs. Despite every instinct telling her to leave, her curiosity won. She gripped her flashlight and cautiously climbed the spiral staircase, its steps groaning beneath her weight. At the top of the stairs, the air was colder and the laughter had stopped. In its place, she heard soft, shuffling footsteps coming from a room at the end of the hallway. The door was ajar, swaying slightly as though inviting her inside. She pushed the door open, revealing a child's bedroom frozen in time. A small bed with tattered sheets sat in one corner, and a rocking horse coated in dust rested in the center of the room. On the wall, faded crayon drawings depicted strange figures, stick-figure children surrounded by towering black shapes. Amelia raised her camera and took another photo. As the flash illuminated the room, the rocking horse began to move, creaking rhythmically. A small giggle echoed again, this time right behind her. She spun around, her flashlight beam trembling, but no one was there. The giggle turned into a low, menacing growl. Amelia's eyes darted to the mirror on the wall. In its cracked surface, she saw a pale, skeletal child standing behind her, its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, teeth jagged like shards of glass. She turned to face it, but the child had vanished. Instead, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. Amelia's heart raced as the room darkened, her candle flickering wildly. The crayon drawings on the wall began to change before her eyes, the stick figures twisting into grotesque shapes, their mouths open in silent screams. The haunting unfolds. Amelia tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew thick, each breath feeling heavier than the last. Her flashlight flickered, then died completely, leaving her in near total darkness. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping into an incoherent cacophony. "You shouldn't have come," the guttural voice from earlier hissed. Desperate, Amelia fumbled for her recorder and hit playback, hoping to capture the voices. Instead of whispers, the recorder emitted a blood-curdling scream that seemed to pierce straight into her mind. She dropped it, covering her ears, but the scream didn't stop. It grew louder and louder until it felt as though the very walls of the room were vibrating. Then silence. Amelia opened her eyes to find the room had transformed. The walls were no longer covered in crayon drawings, but in dark, viscous stains that dripped onto the floor. The rocking horse had splintered, instead, its wooden pieces scattered across the room. Suddenly the child's voice spoke again, this time clearer and more haunting. "Will you play with me?" Amelia froze. From the shadows of the room, the pale skeletal figure of the child emerged, holding a mangled teddy bear. Its hollow eyes stared directly into hers. "If you stay, we can play forever," the child said, its voice cracking like breaking glass. The Shadows of Blackwood Manor, Part 3. Amelia stumbled backward, her heart pounding. The skeletal child stepped closer, its movements jerky, as though it were being controlled by unseen strings. The teddy bear in its hand began to twist and writhe, its button eyes melting, and from its mouth a low growl escaped. Amelia's instincts screamed at her to run, but the door was still locked, and the windows were sealed with thick iron bars. Her only option was to face whatever nightmare the manor had in store for her. "I don't want to play!" Amelia shouted, her voice cracking. The child tilted its head unnaturally, as though it didn't understand. Then, with a shriek that shattered the oppressive silence, it lunged at her. Amelia ducked, narrowly avoiding its claw-like hands. She scrambled for her flashlight, smashing it against the creature's outstretched arm. The child recoiled, letting out an unearthly wail as it dissolved into a swirling mist. The mist didn't disappear, though. Instead, it coalesced, forming a tall, shadowy figure with elongated limbs and glowing red eyes. It towered over her, its presence suffocating. "You cannot leave." The voice was deep and resonant, echoing as though it came from the depths of the earth. Amelia's courage faltered. She grabbed her camera and took another photo, hoping the flash would buy her time. The light illuminated the figure, and for a moment it hesitated, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. She took a chance and ran for the door, slamming her shoulder into it. The wood splintered slightly, but it didn't open. The shadow was behind her now, its icy fingers brushing against her back. "You belong to us now," it whispered. The escape attempt. Amelia's mind raced. She remembered something she had read about spirits being bound to objects. Could the drawings, the rocking horse, or even the recorder be anchoring these entities? She grabbed the recorder, now emitting a faint humming sound, and hurled it across the room. The humming stopped, and the shadow faltered for a moment. It was enough. She threw her weight against the door again, and this time it burst open. She ran down the hallway, but the house seemed to shift around her. The walls stretched, the floors tilted, and every door she passed slammed shut on its own. She reached the staircase, but it was no longer intact. A gaping void had replaced several steps, and below was nothing but darkness. Amelia hesitated, but the shadow was closing in. Taking a deep breath, she leapt across the gap, landing hard on the other side. She bolted for the front door, her pulse thundering in her ears. The door was locked, but she could see the faint glow of moonlight outside. Desperate, she grabbed a nearby chair and smashed it against the glass window next to the door. The glass shattered, and she climbed through, cutting her arms on the jagged edges. The moment she stepped onto the overgrown lawn, the screams and whispers stopped. She turned, looked back at the manor. The windows were dark, and the house seemed lifeless once more. But as she stood there, catching her breath, she saw a figure standing in the upstairs window, the skeletal child, clutching its mangled teddy bear. It raised one hand in a slow wave. Amelia didn't stop running until she reached her car. She drove back to town, her hands trembling on the wheel. When she reviewed the footage on her camera, the photos were distorted, showing only streaks of light and darkness. The voice recorder was blank, but her nightmare wasn't over. That night, as she tried to sleep, she heard the faint sound of a rocking horse creaking. Opening her eyes, she saw the shadow of a child standing in the corner of her room, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "Let's play," it whispered. Amelia screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. The Shadows of Blackwood Manor, Part 4. Amelia couldn't sleep. The child's hollow-eyed figure haunted her thoughts. Every creak of her house, every shadow cast by her bedside lamp felt alive. She tried convincing herself it was just her imagination, a trick her traumatized mind was playing. But the whispers returned. It started faintly, almost imperceptible, like wind brushing against her ears. Then came the tapping, a rhythmic knock on her bedroom window. It was impossible. She lived on the 3rd floor. Her breath hitched as she turned her head. The skeletal child was outside, clinging to the glass like a spider, its jagged teeth bared in a twisted grin. The teddy bear in its hand dangled lifelessly, its button eyes dripping black liquid. "You left the game unfinished," it hissed, its voice cracking like ice breaking underfoot. Amelia froze, paralyzed by fear. Before she could react, the window shattered inward, shards spraying across the room. The child crawled in, its movements jerky and inhuman. "You're ours now, Amelia," it growled, lunging toward her. Instinct took over. She grabbed the closest object, a heavy lamp, and swung it with all her strength. The child's figure disintegrated into black mist, but the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, filling every corner of the room, surrounding her. A desperate search. Amelia realized running wasn't an option anymore. The entities had followed her home, tethered to her somehow. She needed answers, fast. She grabbed her laptop and began researching Blackwood Manor in the dead of night. The house's history was even darker than she had imagined. It was once owned by the Blackwood family, who practiced occult rituals in secret. The youngest member, a 6-year-old boy named Henry, had been sacrificed in a failed ritual to summon an ancient entity. His spirit, along with the summoned shadows, was trapped in the manor, bound to haunt anyone who dared disturb their domain. Amelia's heart sank. The entity wasn't just haunting her, it was trying to claim her soul, as it had with others before her. But there was hope. A passage in an old digitized book mentioned a way to break the bond, by returning to the source and performing a cleansing ritual. She would need salt, candles, a mirror, and a symbol carved into the wood of the manor, a sigil of banishment. Back to the manor. At dawn, Amelia packed her supplies and drove back to Blackwood Manor, her stomach twisting in knots. The house looked even more menacing in the early morning light, its shadow stretching like claws across the ground. Stepping inside, the oppressive air returned immediately. Whispers swirled around her, growing louder as she made her way back to the grand hall. Shadows flickered along the walls, and the skeletal child appeared again, this time at the top of the staircase. "You can't leave us again," it hissed. Amelia ignored it, clutching the mirror tightly as she moved toward the center of the hall. She placed the mirror on the floor, surrounded it with candles, and poured a circle of salt around herself. The whispers turned into screams, and the house began to shake. The shadowy figure from before emerged, towering over her. Its red eyes burned like embers, and its voice echoed with unearthly rage. "You dare defy us?" Amelia's hands trembled as she carved the sigil into the wooden floor. "I release you! Return to the void!" she shouted, her voice cracking but determined. The shadow lunged at her, but as the sigil completed, the candles flared brightly. The mirror reflected the shadow's form, trapping it within its surface. The skeletal child let out a final agonized scream before vanishing into the black mist. Freedom? The house fell silent. For the first time, Amelia felt a weight lift off her chest. She picked up the mirror, its surface now dark and cold, and left the manor without looking back. Back at home, Amelia burned the mirror, ensuring no remnants of the entity remained. For weeks, she felt a strange emptiness, as though a part of her had been left behind in the manor. But life slowly returned to normal, or so she thought. One night, as she sat editing her footage, a familiar sound sent chills down her spine. The soft creak of a rocking horse echoed from the corner